Welcome back to Ancient Echoes, where stories linger longer than statues, and the pen often does more damage than the sword. I'm Chelsea, and in this episode we're turning from conquest to composition, from battlefields to bookshelves. Today we step into the literary world of ancient Rome, a world of epic poets, sharp-tongued satirists, scandalous love poems, and speeches so persuasive they could topple a senate. Because if Greece gave us drama and philosophy, Rome gave us something different, a literature of empire, writing that was public, political, polished, and deeply personal. This was a world where your poetry could get you exiled, your plays could win you the public's love, and your letters could outlive your legacy by 2,000 years. No pressure, Cicero. Roman literature wasn't just about beauty or entertainment. It was a tool of power. It shaped Roman identity, reinforced cultural values, celebrated emperors, and occasionally dared to question the world it served. This episode will take us from epic poetry to rhetoric, from whispered verses in gardens to thunderous orations in the Forum. We'll explore how Roman writers borrowed from Greece, sharpened their own voice, and whether writing for emperors or against them left behind a literary legacy that still echoes in our politics, our poetry, and our language itself. Let's begin where Rome began, with borrowed myths and borrowed meters, and see how imitation gave way to innovation and how the written word helped build the empire it outlasted. Before Roman writers became Roman icons, they were students of Greece. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then early Roman literature was practically a love letter to the Greek world. And like most love letters, it began with awkward mimicry, evolved into stylistic obsession, and eventually morphed into something entirely its own. The earliest Roman authors, Livius, Andronicus, Plautus, and Aeneid, weren't breaking new ground. They were translating, adapting, and reshaping Greek forms into Latin structure. Livius Andronicus translated Homer's Odyssey into Latin. Aeneid declared that he had 3 hearts because he spoke Greek, Latin, and Oscan, and he used all 3 to write an epic, the Annals, in Homeric style. Plautus borrowed new comedy from Greek playwrights like Menander and made it brasher, louder, and even more Roman. Cue more drinking, more slapstick humor, and more scheming slaves. In modern terms, think of the early Roman literary scene like Hollywood remaking foreign films, sometimes faithful, sometimes flashy, but always hungry for impact. This borrowing wasn't lazy, it was strategic. Greek was the language of culture, philosophy, and prestige. For centuries, educated Romans were bilingual, but as Rome's political power grew, there was an increasing push to make Latin not just the language of law, but of art. Latin literature became a national project, a way of saying, we're more than soldiers, we're thinkers, we're poets, we have taste. And slowly, Rome began to find its voice. So, what made Roman literature distinct? While the Greeks focused on cosmic questions of the gods, fate, the hero's tragic flaw, Romans often focused on duty, honor, public service, and the eternal balancing act between individual ambition and the good of the state. Their literature embraced structure and order, much like their architecture. It idealized mos maiorum, or the way of the ancestors. It treated personal emotion not as a right, but as political liability. And above all, tied art to action, because what good is poetry if it doesn't serve Rome? This was not the place for abstract philosophical musings in a cave. This was a world where your writing might be read aloud in the Forum, quoted by senators, or used as evidence against you in exile. Roman literature started in imitation, but imitation sharpened into identity. Greek forms gave Roman writers their scaffolding, Latin gave them their identity, and the world around them, bustling cities, family politics, street noise, and civil war, gave them something to write about. Next, we'll meet the heavyweights, Virgil and Ovid, and explore how poetry was used to build a national myth, and sometimes to push back against the power it was meant to glorify. If Rome had a literary Olympus, Virgil and Ovid would be sitting near the top, though not necessarily on speaking terms. One was the poetic voice of the Augustan regime, the other became its most poetic exile. Together, they tell us everything we need to know about how poetry in Rome wasn't just art, it was statecraft. Let's start with Plebeius Virgilius Maro, or better known as Virgil. Commissioned by Augustus himself, Virgil's Aeneid, written between 29 and 19 BC, was Rome's answer to Homer, a national epic that traced Roman greatness back to divine fate, Trojan tragedy, and lots of impressive speeches made before dying heroically. The hero, Aeneas, flees the burning city of Troy, carries his father on his back, and sails west to found what will one day become Rome. The message? Rome didn't rise by accident. It was destined. Think of it as Rome's origin story, carefully curated by its first emperor and penned by someone who understood that flattery is best delivered in hexameter. But the Aeneid is more than propaganda. It's also complicated. Aeneas is noble, yes, but haunted, heavy with duty. He sacrifices love, goodbye Dido, and happiness for the sake of a future he will never see. He wins, but only by losing everything personal. That's not triumph, that's Roman virtue. Stoic, patriotic, and deeply tragic. It's the literary equivalent of we're not crying, we're conquering. And then there's Ovid. Born just after Caesar's assassination, Ovid was witty, brilliant, and famously unbothered by authority. While Virgil was building Rome's origin myth, Ovid was writing poems about love affairs, or known as the amores, seduction advice and ars amorataria, and mythological transformations and metamorphosis. He told these stories with dazzling beauty and just enough irreverence to make censors nervous. Where Virgil wrote to uphold Roman ideals, Ovid wrote to tease them. The Metamorphoses is a sprawling mythological epic full of gods behaving badly, mortals suffering beautifully, and identities constantly in flux. It's poetic genius, but it's also full of ambiguity. The power is unstable, the gods are inconsistent, love is often dangerous, and transformation is the only constant. It's like reading a poetic fever dream, where every moment of beauty comes with a twist, and occasionally a snake-haired woman. Ovid's irreverence eventually caught up with him. In 8 AD, Augustus exiled him to Tomis on the Black Sea, effectively the edge of the empire. The official reason? Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. Historians still debate what the error was. Was it the ars amatoria? Did Ovid offend someone powerful? Was he simply too clever, too cheeky, and too unwilling to follow the script? Whatever the cause, Ovid spent the rest of his life writing sad letters to Rome from exile, watching the city's literary heart from the outside. In a way, he became what his poetry always suggested, someone transformed by forces beyond his control. So what does this tell us about Roman literature? In Virgil and Ovid, we see two poles of Roman poetic life. With Virgil, we see the voice of Rome's official story, structure, noble, and ultimately state-sanctioned. With Ovid, he's the wild card, brilliant, biting, and vanished. Together, they show us that Roman literature didn't just reflect the empire, it wrestled with it, beautified it, questioned it, and in Ovid's case, occasionally irritated it into exile. Because in Rome, writing was powerful, and power, especially imperial power, likes its stories told in a certain way, Next, we'll step away from the page and into the public square, because while poetry whispered, drama shouted, and in the theaters of Rome, the stage wasn't just a platform, it was a mirror. Up next, satire, spectacle, and the fine line between performance and politics. If poetry in Rome was read in private gardens and recited at dinner parties, drama was the art of the street. The Roman stage was loud, open-aired, slightly chaotic, and much like modern political Twitter, equal parts entertainment, outrage, and thinly veiled criticism. It was also one of the few places where you could call someone powerful a fool, as long as you did it in verse and wore a silly mask. As with most Roman art, drama began by borrowing heavily from the Greeks. Roman playwrights adapted Greek New Comedy, so domestic plots, clever slaves, grumpy fathers, mistaken identities, but they added their own flair. More spectacle, more slapstick, and a lot more socially acceptable eye-rolling at the upper class. Plautus, from 254 to 184 BC, was the king of Roman comedy. His plays were wild, physical, and full of fast talkers and tricksters. Terence, from 195 to 159 BC, originated from North Africa, and he brought more polish and subtlety to Roman drama. His Latin style was so admired that later writers used his plays to teach grammar. If Plautus was the sitcom you watched for chaos, Terence was the one you quoted to sound clever at dinner. These plays weren't performed in cozy little black box theaters. They were staged in front of rowdy, mostly male crowds, sometimes in the middle of public festivals where attendance was strongly encouraged by the state. Because nothing builds civic unity quite like watching a slave outwit its master and steal his wine. But Roman drama wasn't just about laughs. It was also a pressure valve, one of the few cultural spaces where critique of Roman society, hypocrisy, and abuse of power could safely exist. Enter the satirists. Unlike Greek satire, which usually meant gentle ribbing, Roman satire was more like being hit with a scroll full of bricks. Writers like Horace, who preferred subtle irony and charming self-deprecation, and Juvenal, who went full scorched earth on everyone. Corrupt officials, greedy women, immoral poets, lazy citizens, basically all of Rome. Juvenal is what happens when a classic scholar decides it's finally time to burn every bridge and annotate it. Satire was a literary form unique to Rome. It didn't exist in Greece, which says a lot, considering the Greeks invented cynicism. In Rome, performance was never just art. It was public discourse, and often a thin disguise for commentary that wouldn't pass in the Senate. Theaters were sponsored by elites, often politicians, who used them to gain public favor. So while you watched a slave mock his master or a cowardly soldier get tricked by a courtesan, you were also absorbing subtle, sometimes not so subtle, messages about class tensions, corrupt leadership, gender expectations, and the occasional jab at military incompetence. Because nothing reassures the public like watching a general fall into a mud puddle while a freed woman quotes Virgil at him. So why did this all matter? Roman drama taught its audience to laugh, but also to look sideways at power. It was deeply performative, endlessly recycled, and occasionally vulgar. It was deeply performative, endlessly recycled, and occasionally vulgar, but it was also sharp, strategic, and more honest than most political speeches. And when satire moved from stage to the page, it became part of a literary tradition that still we see in everything from political cartoons to late-night monologues. Because apparently, no matter the century, there's something cathartic about calling the emperor an idiot, as long as you do it in dialectic hexameter. Next, we'll leave the stage lights behind and get personal, because Roman writers weren't just talking to the crowd. They were writing about love, exile, friendship, and the maddening, messy business of being human. Up next, lyric poetry, longing, and the eternal Roman tradition of turning heartbreak into beautiful Latin verse. After all the wars, political scheming, and dramatic stage slapping, you might be wondering, did the Romans ever just feel things? The answer is yes, and when they did, they usually wrote it down in very precise meter with a surprisingly high vocabulary count. Welcome to Roman lyric poetry, where love, longing, and personal angst were expressed with more elegance than most modern weddings. Let's begin with Gaius Valerius Catullus, writing in the late Republic. Catullus was passionate, personal, and often just tired of everyone. His poems range from tender love lyrics to blistering takedowns of his enemies and sometimes his friends. His most famous subject, Lesbia, the pseudonym for a woman he loved, hated, missed, and possibly never fully understood. One of his most quoted lines is, "I hate and I love. Why do I do this, you might ask? I don't know, but I feel it, and it tears me apart." It's like ancient Rome's version of "It's Complicated" on Facebook, but with more iambic depth. Catullus brought rawness into Roman poetry. He made emotion literary, and literary emotion personal. Following Catullus, the elegiac poets took over. Think Propertius and Tibullus. They wrote about love, yes, but also about absence, exile, and the feeling of being misunderstood by literally everyone. They leaned into the idea of the lovesick poet, wounded, wistful, dramatically sighing near fountains. Their poetry was filled with gods and dreams, longing for women with suspiciously mythological names, and an overwhelming sense that being in love was somehow both noble and completely debilitating. Essentially, I would conquer cities, but I have a crush and therefore cannot leave my couch. Then there's Horace, Rome's poet of moderation, wisdom, and occasional eye-rolling. Horace wasn't as fiery as Catullus or as weepy as Tibullus. He preferred balance, writing about friendship, wine, the passing of time, and how fleeting fame and ambition really are. He gave us the phrase carpe diem, or seize the day, though he probably meant it more as don't procrastinate than YOLO. Horace feels like that one professor who reminds you, gently, that your final exam isn't the end of the world, but also, neither are you. What makes Roman lyric poetry unique? It brought the private into public, personal emotion expressed in structured, performative ways. It explored love as both elevating and annihilating. Romantic relationships were often more psychological than sensual, and it revealed the inner tension of Roman identity, duty versus desire, ambition versus rest, public persona versus private longing. Roman lyric poetry didn't try to solve emotional contradiction. It just described it, beautifully and sometimes bitterly. Because what's more Roman than expressing existential dread in a perfect egliac couplets? So while emperors were building roads and generals were reshaping provinces, poets were shaping something more enduring, how Romans felt and how they made meaning out of all that feeling. Next, we turn to Roman nonfiction, the voices of senators, historians, and the statesmen who used their words not to woo, but to warn. From Cicero's courtroom to Tacitus' judgmental pen, it's time to explore literature as persuasion, performance, and power. Not all Roman literature was written to charm or console. Some of it was written to command. Because while lyric poets sighed over lost love and satirists rolled their eyes at social decay, another group of writers stepped forward, not to entertain, but to shape policy, influence public opinion, and define how Rome remembered itself. This is the world of rhetoric and historiography, where words were used less like brushstrokes and more like finely sharpened daggers. Welcome to Roman prose, where every sentence is a strategic maneuver, and flourish usually means I'm about to ruin somebody's reputation. First up, Marcus Tullius Cicero, philosopher, orator, and the unofficial spokesperson for the late Republican anxiety. Cicero believed in the power of the spoken word. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a performer, delivering speeches so eloquent that they were copied, published, and studied for centuries. His greatest hits were the Catilinarian orations, or dramatic denunciations of a political conspiracy, and the Philippics, which were furious attacks against Mark Antony after Caesar's assassination. And then he has dozens of speeches, essays, and letters arguing for Republican values while watching them dissolve in real time. He was basically the Roman equivalent of someone live tweeting a constitutional crisis with better Latin and more risk of decapitation. Cicero used rhetoric not just to win cases, but to shape public memory, to defend philosophy, and to warn that once liberty is gone, no voice remains but that of a tyrant. Spoiler, he was right. He was also executed shortly after delivering that message. So, effective but not subtle. If Cicero gave Rome its voice, then Livy and Tacitus gave it a memory, and a sharply opinionated one at that. Livy, writing during Augustus's reign, produced Ab Urb Condita, a sprawling history of Rome from its mythical origin to its present day. His tone is idealistic, moralizing, and nostalgic. Livy didn't just want to preserve history, he wanted to remind Rome of what it used to be, before all the corruption, civil wars, and people casually declaring themselves gods. Tacitus, writing a century later, had a darker view. His works, the Annals and the Histories, document Rome's imperial politics with biting wit and thinly veiled contempt. He painted emperors like Tiberius, Nero, and Domitian not as great rulers, but as cautionary tales. So if Livy was your idealistic history teacher, Tacitus was the sarcastic colleague down the hall muttering, "This is all falling apart and no one is paying attention." So what made Roman prose so powerful? Well, precision, whether in the courtroom or on the page, every word was meticulously weighted. Moral framing, so even biased histories weren't just what happened, but what ought to have happened. They were public performance. Much of this writing was meant to be read aloud to persuade an audience, not just inform them. And the personal stakes. These writers weren't objective observers. They were deeply involved in the systems they described. Roman prose didn't hide its agenda, it leaned into it, using language as a tool of influence, reflection, and legacy. Because in a world where reputations outlived regimes, the real power wasn't just being remembered, it was controlling the narrative. So while Roman generals built roads and aqueducts, its writers built memory. Layered, biased, brilliant memory. Some of it flattered, some of it warned, but all of it helped shape what we still call Rome. As we reflect, we'll step back from the scrolls and speeches to consider why Rome wrote so much, and what these voices tell us about how empires see themselves and how they wanted to be seen. Rome built monuments to impress the gods. It built roads to move armies. It built aqueducts to tame nature. But it wrote to endure. Through poetry and prose, satire and speech, Rome left us not just what it did, but how it thought, what it felt, and how it wanted to be remembered. Because in the end, every empire writes its own eulogy, usually before it realizes it's one. In Virgil, we saw a people trying to justify power with destiny. In Ovid, we saw that same power squirm under the weight of beauty and mischief. In satire, Rome laughed at itself because it had to. And in history and rhetoric, it recorded its triumphs and occasionally tried to rewrite its regrets. Roman literature isn't just a mirror of empire. It's a record of ambition, fear, love, loss, propaganda, protest, and everything in between. Thanks for joining me on this literary tour of the Roman world. If this episode has you quoting Horace, side-eyeing emperors, or finally understanding why Cicero was always yelling, then my job here is done. In our next episode, we'll dive further into the Roman Empire. Until then, may your words be precise, your sources cited, and your literary ambitions just slightly less imperial.